Hi, this is Embrosewyn Tazkuvel, and this is the Prophet's Voice for 2025, Part 2. Originally, I was going to talk about families and world-changing population trends and the calamities that are going to be resulting from that, but the current events that are going down in the Russian-Ukraine war have actually moved to the forefront, and I need to talk about that next. So during this talk, I'm going to be sharing several maps, and I'll leave the links for those maps, for the source of the maps, in the description of the video. But before I begin, for those who only want to hear the bottom line and are not interested in the fascinating whys or the details, here's a quick summary of what you can expect from this conflict in the near future and beyond that. Though the future is not set in stone, please do remember that. Different outcomes can surprise us and are still possible, but based upon the current events, the current dynamics that are happening, Russia will win this war. They will retain the lands that they've conquered in Ukraine. They will be accepted back into fairly normal relations with the United States and most European countries. However, they are going to be retaining a hidden agenda, which is to continue to conquer and expand their boundaries in the future. Now, to put a little bit at ease, it's not currently likely that there's going to be nuclear war or World War III exploding directly from this current war. But this should actually only be considered a temporary reprieve, as that danger is going to loom larger in the future. Now, even in this war, both of those things, nuclear attack and World War III, are still possible because of this war and could still occur in the next few years. It kind of depends upon the actions that are taken by the US and European countries to restrain Russia's expansionist aims and to economically counter the strengthening alliance that's occurring between Russia and China. Now, that's it in a nutshell. But there's actually so much more to understand, and I invite you to stick around for an in-depth explanation of the why and what can happen to make everything much worse, as well as what needs to happen to make everything much better, peaceful, and harmonious. Still here? Okay, let's dig a little deeper. So at the time of this video, the war between Russia and Ukraine has been raging since February of 2022. And it's estimated that around 800,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or severely injured since the war began. Now that's a very big number. Think about it. That's almost 1 million soldiers. 800,000 soldiers. What a waste. Now because Ukraine was invaded by Russia and the war is actually being fought almost exclusively on Ukrainian territory, the Ukrainian losses have been much less than Russia because they've been fighting from behind fortified defensive positions, while the Russians have had to send one wave of soldiers after another, often over empty fields full of landmines, trying to take the Ukrainian positions. In fact, those waves are nicknamed meat waves because the slaughter of the attacking Russian soldiers is so great, going over these empty fields full of mines, trying to just get close enough to the Ukrainian defensive lines to do something. So just a reminder, this war began when about 200,000 Russian soldiers and their tanks and their warplanes and their missiles initiated a surprise attack on Ukraine from three sides. They had been calling their border movements of troops just war games, but they weren't war games, they were war actuality. And they attacked, the greatest number was from Belarus, which is the country that's immediately north of Ukraine and is a steadfast ally of Russia. So even though Belarusian soldiers have not fought against Ukraine, they have certainly allowed their country to be used as a launching pad for the Russian attacks. Now, reflecting back, Ukraine was basically peacefully minding its own business, wasn't seeking to instigate any direct conflict with Russia. And Russia's attack, therefore, was really raw aggression. And this actually began the greatest military conflict that they've had in Europe since World War II. So what I want to look at is why? Why did Russia attack? And why are they still trying to conquer Ukraine after all their losses, despite really terrible attrition on their side for over 3 years? Why are they doing this to themselves and to the Ukrainians? And also want to look at how this war could escalate into World War III, which of course was going to have a negative impact on all of our lives, regardless of where we live or what our politics are. And this is certainly a possibility if political leaders in the United States and Europe fail to understand the root of the conflict and to understand the only actions that they can take to permanently stop it. It's one of the reasons I'm making the videos, not just for the Celestian Light. I'm hoping that some of the leaders of the world will look at this and understand this conflict from an in-depth perspective so they have a better understanding of what they need to do for solutions. Now, to help you better understand the situation, I'm going to share some important Russian history. So don't go, oh no, history. It's going to be very short, but very important, because if you understand Russian history, you can understand the way the Russians are thinking today and about this conflict and about how it needs to end. So some of the information I'll be sending or telling you about is really not available. It's not published. Maybe the upper military echelons know about it, but they certainly don't tell anybody about it. The only reason I know about these things is because of my connection to the Taz. And if you're wondering what the Taz are, just read my book, Demon Hunter. So looking a little deeper, we need to look at the Russian history to comprehend why they've been willing to sacrifice so many soldiers, so much military equipment, like ships and tanks and jets, and suffer very strong economic sanctions as well from Western countries, just to attack Ukraine, and to continue to do so after 3 years at even more intense levels, at greater sacrifices of men and equipment, and their economy. The longer this goes on, the more their economy is hurt by it. They're currently running about 21% in their interest rates, which is really hurting their business, but that's probably going to go up as well. So we also need to look at the perspective of Europe and the United States and other allied countries, because to them, when they look at what Russia did, attacking as a surprise attack, it just seems that raw, naked aggression against a country that only wants to be left in peace and left alone. And it's because of this perception of raw aggression by Russia, which is a country that has a very long history of similar type of attacks to conquer and subjugate other lands and people. It's because of these things that many people in European countries, many leaders in European countries, have been particularly alarmed and have come to the defense of Ukraine, hoping to stop Russia there before their aggressive actions expand beyond the borders of Ukraine to other countries. And in fact, anyone from an older generation remembers how right after World War II, the Soviet Union, which is AKA Russia, basically, occupied several European countries, and they don't want to see something like that happen to those European countries again. Those are their countries. Keep the Russians out. They came here once before. We don't want them anymore. So Europeans feel it should be up to each country to decide their political path based upon the people speaking and voting in fair and democratic elections for the government they desire, and that those people have freedom, which the people that were in the countries that were subjugated by Russia did not have. In fact, Russia looks at things completely different than Europeans. They don't see it that way at all as far as democratic elections and everybody minds their own border. Now, that's not the way they think. They have over 1,000 years of history that's interwoven into an entirely different narrative. So to understand why Russia is unrelenting in its attack on Ukraine today, we need to understand how Russian history strongly shapes the feelings and motivations of Russians, from their upper leaders to the common people, even to the point of initiating and supporting wars of aggression against their neighbors. And how is this possible? And how is it possible that after 3 years of terrible attrition, this war is still supported by 75 to 80% of Russian citizens, despite its heavy cost? So to comprehend that, you have to look at the understanding that, first off, Russian history began in Kiev, Ukraine. Kiev actually has a very special spot of love in the heart of Russians, because Kiev was the first capital of the Russian lands from the late 900s until it was destroyed and broken apart by the Mongol invasion from 1237 to 1240. Now, following the defeat of the Mongols by the Russian army at the Battle of Kulikovo, in 1380, Moscow became the center of the Russian state because the lands and people around Kiev had been devastated. St. Petersburg was the other great city of Russia at that time and going forward. In the 13 and 1400s, Russia made concerted efforts to consolidate and control what they called the Russlands. Now, the Russlands were places that might be outside of their borders, but they had a significant portion of population that spoke Russian and had cultural and religious ties to Russia. This becomes a very important point to understand. To the Russians, even if you're in another country, like Ukraine, for instance, they feel that, hey, if there's a lot of people in that country that speak Russian and want to belong to the Russian Orthodox Church, and they have other cultural ties to Russia, well, then that should be part of Russia. And they have no compunctions about just invading that country to absorb it into Russia because, hey, those are people who speak Russian there, and they go to our church. We have to become part of our country. That's the way Russians think. I know it's weird for most people, but that is the way they think. And a little bit more of their history. In 1547, Ivan the Terrible created the Tsardom of Russia. And this was officially elevated to an emperor position in 1613 when Michael Romanov became crowned the first Tsar of the Romanov dynasty. And that dynasty lasted from then through many hundred years up until 1917, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Because after the Romanov dynasty began, the Russian Empire continued to expand rapidly during the 1600s, conquering and controlling many ethnic tribes in Siberia, and they just kept going until they got all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Now, officially, Russia was enshrined worldwide politically as an empire in 1721, when Peter the Great took the throne as the Tsar or Emperor. And that lasted up until 1917, World War I times, when the Tsar at that time, Nicholas, was forced to abdicate, and that was followed by 5 years of unrest and political wars between various factions that culminated in 1922 with the merger of the Russian republics of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. Those republics all merged together to become the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which has commonly been referred to as the Soviet Union. Now, during and immediately after World War II, this was a very key time, and it actually plays a key part in what's going on right now in Ukraine. Because after World War II, the USSR militarily occupied and established puppet governments in several Eastern European countries, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and the eastern half of current-day Germany, including the eastern half of the city of Berlin. The Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were already physically republics of the USSR. And this eastern bloc of countries became known as the Warsaw Pact. It was a pact between them that they would always stick together and fight off anybody who tried to attack any of them. And this was also commonly known as the Iron Curtain, because those countries that were behind the Iron Curtain, the Warsaw Pact countries, were allowed by the USSR to have almost no commercial or cultural relations with Western world. And those that were extremely and highly controlled, very limited. And the city of Berlin, Germany, was split in half by a formidable wall. And anyone from the eastern part that tried to escape to Western Germany was shot by German border guards. So these countries were like giant prison camps. I actually experienced the closed nature of the Eastern Bloc countries, even for basic information, when I tried to research my family's genealogy. My grandfather and his family immigrated in the early 1900s from the point where Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Russia shared a border. You can look at this map and you can see where that is. Today, those countries, they've changed borders a lot in Europe. Now it's the countries of Slovakia, Ukraine, and Hungary. At the time I was doing my genealogical research, there was literally no records available from those countries behind the Iron Curtain. And also an important thing to note as you look at this map is that what today are the countries of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova were not separate countries. They were physically republics or states of the USSR. So a big rallying cry for the Ukraine war today from the Ukrainian side is that they need to get back the Crimea Peninsula that Russia occupied in 2014 and then subsequently annexed and became part of Russia. Now, what never seems to be pointed out in any news articles or anything I've ever seen is that even when Ukraine was a state of the USSR, the Crimean Peninsula, for the most part, was a part of the Russian Republic, not the Ukrainian Republic. It was only in 1954 that the political leader of the USSR, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, arbitrarily decided that for purely administrative purposes, he wanted to make the Crimean Peninsula Oblast. Oblast is like a county in Russian lingo. Oblast, a part of the Ukrainian Republic. Why? Because it's a peninsula that's attached to the Ukrainian Republic, and it was a lot easier to get to Crimea by land from Ukraine. From Russia, there was no land access. So it just made sense administratively to put the Crimea Peninsula in the Ukrainian Republic instead of the Russian Republic. But remember, it was always part of Russia. Ukraine was part of Russia at that time. It was just another county, another state of Russia. So keep in mind that when Ukraine says that they want the return of the Crimean Peninsula, what they're really demanding is that Russia give them what historically has been part of Russia, not Ukraine, and was only aligned with Ukraine for administrative purposes in 1954 when both Russia and Ukraine were part of the USSR. Now, in 1991, due to multiple internal challenges that were occurring, the USSR dissolved. In the next couple of years, 15 of the former Soviet republics declared independence and formed their own countries. And Ukraine was one of those states that broke away and declared themselves to be an independent country. And as you look at this map, you can see Russia is in red, and all of those former states or republics that were part of Russia and became independent countries are shown in a pink color. So now with that background, let's look at the Russian-Ukrainian war from the perspective of the Russian side and from the European side, as this war is only going to end if everyone clearly understands the other side's fears, the other side's motivations, and their security needs, and their history. So Russian political and business leaders take great pride in the long history of their country as an empire. They also greatly resent, feel humiliated, and hope to reverse the catastrophe of the collapse of the Soviet Union and then the subsequent creation of 15 new countries, including Ukraine, from the ashes of the Soviet Union. Now, just before the dissolution occurred, the Soviet Union was a country that covered 1/6 of the landmass of the Earth. It covered 11 time zones, had the second largest economy in the world, the largest military, had several Eastern European countries under military occupation, and at its zenith, the Soviet Union had over 10,000 nuclear bombs. Now, in a very short time, the reluctant new country of Russia that came out of all of that dissolution went from an economic and military global superpower as USSR to a country with 25% less land, half of its previous population, withdrawal of all of its military occupational forces in European countries, and an economy, not superpower anymore, now only as big as Italy. Even worse, in the Russian eyes, the former Russian republics, the states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and the former military-occupied vassal countries of Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, and Romania, and Albania, all became members of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that was created after World War II to contain Russian power and expansion. Now, Russia makes no pretense about their relationship with NATO. Russian leaders and Russian news people publicly proclaim that NATO is the enemy. And the fact that the boundaries of NATO countries have encroached right up to the borders of Russia is a very, very big deal to them. Additionally, the formerly neutral countries of Sweden and Finland, which have been neutral since World War II, started to feel very vulnerable once they saw Russia invade Ukraine, and so they've also recently joined NATO, further surrounding Russia. In fact, Finland shares an 832-mile border with Russia. And then there's Kaliningrad. If you take a look at this map of Kaliningrad, And you can see this little red enclave here, surrounded by Poland to the south and Lithuania to the north, Belarus over here to the west, and Russia way up over here. What happened is that after World War II, the Soviet Union insisted that this city and the surrounding land that was formerly the city of Königsberg, Germany, be given to the Soviet Union as a war prize. And the Allies, the United States and French and the English, they all agreed to that. And this allowed the Soviet Union to have a year-round ice-free port on the Baltic Sea in the heart of Europe, and they've made very good use of it. All the German citizens were expelled from their lands, from their homes, from their businesses, and Russian immigrants replaced them. Now, prior to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Kaliningrad was easily accessible by train or road through the Soviet Baltic states. You can see how they can connect right from Russia through the Baltic states to Kaliningrad, or they could go through Soviet-controlled Poland by land or rail. But since all of those countries have since become free countries and have joined NATO, currently Russia has what they see as a very big dilemma. They no longer have a secure, guaranteed land connection to the most strategically vital Kaliningrad, where Russian bases lots of nuclear weapons and significant naval assets. So, considering all of these factors, what are the minimum results that Russia will accept as the outcome of the Ukrainian war? And what's going to make them accept that? Well, obviously their own losses and economic sanctions diminishing of their country instead of enriching of their country is going to be the pressure that's going to need to be put on them if it's not military. And what are Russia's greatest territorial aspirations if they're not adequately pressured? That's another question you need to ask, because up until now, guess what? They have not been adequately pressured. Not at all. They're still very firm in what they want to do, and they still intend to go through and do it, which is, let's talk about it a little more. The least acceptable outcome for Russia is that they will not relinquish the Ukrainian lands that they've conquered and currently occupy. Now remember, this is the least that they'll accept. So this includes all the Crimea Peninsula, the Donetsk, Luhansk, and Oblast, and parts of the Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast. So Ukraine still occupies significant parts of the Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast, including the biggest cities in both. So the minimum results that Russia expects to achieve and is striving for as a minimum final status is 1. Complete occupation and control of these 4 oblasts. 2. World recognition and acceptance that they are part of Russia. 3. Treaty guarantees that Ukraine will never be allowed to join the European Union. 4. They also want to guarantee that Ukraine will be forbidden to join NATO or to have NATO troops in its country. And 5. They want a disarmament of Ukraine to the point that they cannot be any kind of military threat in the future. Basically, they want to win the war. So if there is insufficient resistance from Ukraine and the countries that are currently supporting Ukraine financially and with military equipment, then Russia thinks a little bigger. Then they have their medium expectations, which is to bring whatever is left of Ukraine fully back under Russian dominance and military occupation, the whole country. And Russia has, unfortunately, bigger goals than Ukraine as well. They want to continue to reestablish and expand their empire. They want those 15 republics back. They want to be back to superpower status. So whether it goes forward, whether Russia goes forward with those plans, or stops with Ukraine is going to depend upon the strength of the resolve and the financial commitment that the United States and the European countries put up and show to Russia to dissuade them from further actions. Now, a very big goal of Russia is to reestablish the secure land corridor to its enclave Kaliningrad. And the easiest way for them to do this is to attack and reoccupy the 3 Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which were formerly Russian republics. Remember, Russian states. But now they're members of NATO, the enemy. Now, these are very tiny countries, both geographically and by population. In fact, the entire country of Estonia only has 1.3 million citizens, which is similar in population to the city of Prague. Latvia has just 1.8 million citizens, which is similar to the population of Vienna. And the largest Baltic country, Lithuania, has only 2.7 million residents, which is similar to the population of Rome. So Russia successfully attacking and occupying these countries would actually only take a matter of days, except they're now part of NATO. The 31 NATO countries have a treaty obligation to come to the military aid of any NATO country attacked by a non-NATO country. And that is a very big shield for the tiny Baltic countries. Kudos for them for so quickly after declaring independence getting to be adopted into the NATO treaty, because boy, without that shield, they'd probably already be back in Russia. And the likelihood of Russia attacking the 3 Baltic countries now, as they're part of NATO, it was still pretty great because those 3 countries were kind of geographically isolated from the nearest NATO bases. But since Sweden and Finland recently joined NATO, now NATO is right at the doorstep, right across the little teeny Baltic Sea from those Baltic countries. And if Russia attacks, NATO will be able to respond very quickly. And they will not likely to be able to be conquered and occupied by Russia anytime soon. But prior to that, they would have been able to easily been conquered and occupied before NATO could even react. All right, so reintegrating the Baltic countries back into Russia is still a goal of Russia, despite the fact that they're NATO. But it's not one that's going to be pursued until the Ukraine war is concluded. And even then, Russia will need to first succeed at weakening the bonds of NATO and the commitments of the NATO countries to one to another before they would be willing to attack the Baltic countries. So guess what? They are actively working to undermine NATO and to do exactly that, to weaken their commitments to one another. But that's a long-term game, so the Baltics are safe for a few years. Now, one caveat in all of that is if NATO countries put combat soldiers in Ukraine, which they are talking about doing as, quote, peacekeepers, Russia will consider themselves to be in an open war with NATO, and they will move quickly to attack and occupy the Baltic countries to neutralize NATO in that area and reestablish their land corridor to Kaliningrad. Now, because of their current nuclear arsenal of a little over 4,500 nuclear warheads, Russia would feel that the US and the Europeans are going to be too afraid of the nuclear consequences to actually engage in combat with the Russian army, even if they attack and occupy the Baltic countries. But NATO's all they've got right now. They just have to show a firmer resolve to keep Russia at bay. So let's take a quick look now at the European perspective of all of this. And the first one is that they breathed a huge sigh of naive relief when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991 and 15 former Soviet republics became independent countries. So at the conclusion of World War II, Eastern Europe fell under what became known as the Iron Curtain, as I mentioned earlier. And all of those countries and their entire populations came under the military boot of the Soviet Union. Freedom became non-existent. These were basically giant prison camps. Freedom to even visit a Western country was strictly forbidden, and any attempts to do so resulted in very harsh prison terms and even death. But the subjugation of European countries by the Soviet Union after World War II was actually just the latest in a long list of the Russian Empire attacking and annexing lands of neighboring countries. So because of its history, covering hundreds of years, right up to the years immediately after World War II, most of the countries in Europe, and especially those that have actually had their lands stolen and occupied militarily by Russia in the past, they still fear that possibility in the future. They've seen 100 years of Russia doing the same thing, hundreds of years of Russia doing the same thing. They haven't seen any evidence that Russia's got a change of heart by attacking Ukraine, by other places like Chechnya that they also went after. They're showing that, hey, we still want to keep that empire expanding. So the Europeans, their goal is to contain Russia, and they use NATO for that, and to prevent any territorial expansion. And they're highly supportive financially, logistically, and with military equipment of the Ukrainians fighting Russia, because as history has proven many times to them, they have a justifiable fear that if Russia succeeds at conquering Ukraine, that the countries next to Ukraine are going to be next in line and next in Russia's crosshairs for the next invasion. And they're not wrong to think this way, because without the United States to protect these countries militarily through NATO, honestly, Europe is a dead man walking if Russia attacks. They simply do not have the manpower or the military capacity, even slightly, to go against Russia without the United States. Now, something of great significance to take note of, and this is pertinent to the situation right now. When Russia first invaded Ukraine, they actually thought it was going to be pretty quick and easy. They didn't think the Ukrainians were going to be too much of a fight. They didn't realize how much the Ukraine had actually been able to rearm since they were disarmed after they became an independent country and had to give up all their nuclear missiles to Russia. Guess what? This war wouldn't even be happening if Ukraine still had their nuclear missiles. But they were convinced by the United States and Europe that after they became an independent country, that if they gave their nuclear missiles where? Back to Russia, and if they gave their long-range bombers back to Russia, that the United States and Europe would protect them if Russia ever attacked them. So Ukraine believed that, and they gave up their nuclear bombs, they gave up their long-range bombers, they gave up a lot of their military equipment, and then once they were pretty much disarmed, then it was time for Russia to attack. Well, because of all that disarmament, Russia thought it was going to be pretty easy to capture Ukraine. And it was a lot harder than they thought. It's still going on 3 years from now because the Europeans grudgingly and gradually kept giving the Ukraine more and more military hardware to help defend themselves. But even still, Russia has done something that the Europeans and the United States have not matched, and it's going to be greatly to their detriment if they don't pay attention here. Russia has switched their economy from a commercial economy to a war economy. They are currently allocating, please take note of this number, 30% of their GDP, their gross domestic product, for the entire annual budget. 30% now goes to the military, to their factories that are producing tanks and bombers and munitions and other military hardware. And those factories are now operating 3 shifts a day, 24/7. They're planning, obviously, with this kind of allocation of resources to the military, they're planning for a much bigger war than with just Ukraine. So Europe should definitely be trembling in their boots a little bit and taking a lot bigger actions than they are if they want to still keep their own sovereignty. And on top of all that, Russia still has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. So just to give you a comparison, remember that number, 30% of Russia's GDP annual budget is now going to the military. By comparison, the greatest amount that any NATO country in Europe is spending on defense is 3% of their annual gross domestic product. Poland recently said that they're considering upping theirs to 4.5% of their gross domestic product, but at this point, the most any country spends in European NATO is 3%, and only about a dozen of the 29 European members of NATO spend even 2% of their GDP on defense. And on the low end, several spend less than 1.5% of their GDP on defense compared to Russia's 30%, with factories operating 7 days a week, three shifts a day, 24/7, to put out war armaments, war tanks, war bombers, war bombs. And the only countries in Europe that even have nuclear weapons are France and the United Kingdom. Each only has a few hundred warheads compared to Russia that has over 4,500 nuclear warheads, and some of them are gigantic. Now Ukrainians, of course, have a desire for all of this to end well. They would very much like all of their territory that Russia has claimed and conquered and annexed back, including Crimea. And they've been willing to die to defend their homeland and to try to reclaim the lands that Russia has conquered. And they also want Russia to be required to pay for the rebuilding of all the destruction that Russia has wrought in this war upon Ukraine. So these are all nice wants, and it seems that would be fair, right? But the reality is that without the financial and military supply backing of the United States and European countries, despite the great courage of their soldiers and the heartfelt desires of their citizens, Ukraine would soon be completely conquered and subjugated by the much larger Russian army backed by a far bigger military-industrial base than Ukraine could possibly even get close to. So, given the motivations, hopes, and fears on both sides, is there a solution to this conflict? Yes, there is a solution, but it will be a bitter taste, a most unpleasant compromise to both sides and their allies. Ukraine needs to agree that the lands currently occupied by Russia are permanently part of Russia. And regarding these lands and the 4 oblasts they are part of, Russia needs to agree that the large cities of Kherson and Zaporizhia that are part of these oblasts but are currently still in possession of Ukraine are permanently part of Ukraine. And they'll further need to relinquish control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. They need to give control of that back to Ukraine. NATO needs to agree by treaty that Ukraine will not be allowed to officially become part of NATO, nor will any NATO troops ever be based in Ukraine. Russia, in turn, needs to agree that even though Ukraine is not part of NATO and cannot have NATO bases on its soil, if Russia ever militarily attacks Ukraine again, NATO can respond militarily to defend Ukraine, including with NATO troops. Now, NATO countries, Ukraine, and Russia all need to agree that Russia owes zero reparations to Ukraine and Ukraine owes zero reparations to Russia. Both sides need to agree to do nothing further to limit or restrict the other's commerce or industries. Now, those are things that will actually settle things, but as I said, it is such a bitter compromise that will any side actually agree to do it? That's the big question, isn't it? Or will the war just have to play out until there's one complete victor and one complete loser, which is often how wars need to play out, unfortunately. As I look at the future, honestly, I do not see a permanent peace on the horizon. Russia might accept a temporary ceasefire or peace, but it's just going to be to continue to build their military for future attacks. As I said, Russia has completely flipped their economy and industries to war production. This has been at a big sacrifice to social and other programs, and they're not planning on having all that sacrifice of men and armaments be for a little bit of gain. Now, I've read news editorials where the authors suggest that if Russian President Putin were to die or be overthrown, the impetus for the Ukraine war would end. And the reality is that the leaders that are most likely to come into power if Putin was gone are more radically hardline war hawks than he is. So the reality is the conflict is more likely to escalate quicker and be deadlier if there are other Russian leaders in power. So be careful what you wish for. Remember, the last time that there was an internal revolt in Russia that overthrew the government was in 1991. And what happened? 15 former states of the Soviet Union declared independence, including Ukraine, and half the population of the former USSR went with them. That was a devastating blow for the Russian Empire, and not one of any of the future leaders that might be the leaders in the future of Russia want to see that repeated. So when considering the end of the current war or its continuation and expansion, it's important to understand that Russians learn from their mistakes. They saw, hey, breaking up what happened in 1991, we're not going to let that happen again. But also, it's important to understand that Russia is geared for long-lasting wars. Europeans and Americans, they like things to be over quickly. President Trump, actually campaigned on the promise that he could end the Ukraine war in one day, which he could have if he said, okay, we're no longer going to give any financial or military support to Ukraine. Well, they would totally be unable to defend themselves very long, and the war would be over. They'd sue for peace. However, as I mentioned, that would just be incentive for Russia to go for more. But the other thing to remember is that Russia thinks long term. China's another good one that does the same thing. They think long term, even generationally. So a war of only 3 years, while that seems really long to the United States and Europe, that's not long for Russians. So just to give you a historical example, Russia and Turkey were in military conflict for 350 years between 1568 and 1918, the beginning of World War II. So they actually had 12 major periods of fighting during those years. And Russia fought against Sweden. Everybody likes Sweden, peaceful, loving Sweden. Russia fought against Sweden for 21 years. 21 years, from 1700 to 1721. And Russia fought a war with Napoleon and France for 10 active years of combat in the early 1800s. So they don't mind long-term conflicts. They're like a dog with a bone. They don't want to give it up. They have a goal, something they're trying to achieve. However many soldiers have to be killed, however many tanks have to be destroyed, how long it takes, those are irrelevant to the goals they're trying to achieve. So please keep that in mind as you look at how this conflict can end. So though this is the prophet's voice for 2025, my prediction is for a longer war and any peace to be fleeting. Unless, and there is an unless the Europeans wake up to the danger that they're in and start to rapidly beef up their military sufficiently that if they had a war with Russia, they'd be a serious enough threat on their own without the United States that Russia would consider it wise to settle for what they already have acquired and not press the war further, and as a deterrent. If they have a powerful enough military, even if they're not using it, if it's there, that's a deterrent to Russia to not act any further. And if the European countries are unwilling to up their defensive game a lot, then I'm going to strongly recommend that anyone that can move out of Europe to a safer country do so, especially if they live in a country that was formerly part of the Soviet Union or a vassal state of the Soviet Union. And there are many places in the world that will be safer and prosperous, even if the worst comes to pass in Europe. And I'd recommend any country in North, Central, or South America that has a stable democratic government, a reasonable standard of living, and first world education and healthcare systems. So that's it for now. Part 3 of the Prophet's Voice 2025 will be coming soon, so see you then. Namaste.